Shane Kilkelly, and you're listening to General Intellect Unit. This time we're picking up part 2 of our discussion of Marx and Nature with Tom OBrien. If you didn't catch the first episode, I'd recommend pausing this one, going back one, and starting from there. As always, thanks for listening, and we hope you enjoy the show. This chapter also kind of emphasizes again this like separation and plunder thing. Like this is a theme that is going all the way through. It's going all the way through Marx, right? That like it's the separation of people from their natural conditions of subsistence, and then those natural conditions appear as an alien force that is recombined with people via capital. So the only time you ever see a tree is when it's in the fucking lumber yard being chopped up by you, right? And then that thing is externalized as something to be plundered because you've been separated from it.
And this is such an important point. This point about the alienation of humanity from nature under capitalism is so important because it explains why we are faced with the ecological crises that we see today and feel utterly helpless to address them. Because we see like nature under the system of private property, production of private property, under the capitalist system, it appears as something alien to us. And the most basic and obvious facts that are taught to school children in terms of what we must do in order to survive as a species, we can understand them intellectually. But when we confront nature and say, well, how are we going to change our relationship to it? We feel completely powerless because the alien system of capitalism is operating according to its own logic, and it is coordinating our lives on a material level so that we may have the comprehension of what we need to do, but we feel like, you know, the world around us is something that we cannot connect to and grasp and change because of this use value, exchange value distinction, which creates an alienated relationship between humanity and nature.
Absolutely.
Also, the productive labourers have been stripped of their productive relationship to the land. You know,
yes.
So like that idea of like people having cattle on the commons is gone. The idea, although there's still commons, well, there was until like 20 years ago in Athlone where I lived, there was like a commons where people living in the town could actually buy cattle and put them on and feed them there. Like that idea is like that's totally gone now. And also the relationship. So like if you're like working on your small plot of land, like, and you know you need to keep that land. You can't just zap the crap out of it for 5 years and make heavy money and then just like die. You can't do that. You can't have that relationship. But when everybody's working in productive capacity in a town or a factory or, you know, doing a Zoom or something, right, that they're torn and ripped away from that connection. So if somebody's trying to put a gas oil pipeline through like fucking Canada or somewhere like that, and everybody's stuck in one corner where it's warm and they don't live up there, they don't have that relationship to the land, like that alienation from the point of nature is fundamental in why capitalism can do what it does ecologically.
Yeah. Right. And even like with your production process, even with your involvement in the production process, not just in consumption, right? Like, I mean, like this thing where like if you work in some small manufacturer thing or whatever, the only time you encounter wood, you might never see a tree, but you will see it on the bench in front of you as lumber to be operated on. Or the only time you ever see a pig or whatever is if you work in a fucking slaughterhouse, you know, and this kind of thing, and you see it indoors in the dark. You never see it outside. This kind of stuff. Like, it's kind of hard to not end up like your brain being tricked into thinking of these things as alien objects from another fucking world that like have no meaning, have no connection to anything. They're just things to be operated upon.
And in these chapters, Burkett really emphasizes the importance of the division between town and country, right? And capitalism produces this division, right? That's the origins of capitalism, actually, is people being moved off the land, off of a direct relationship to nature, and operating in a way that is mediated through capital by becoming wage laborers in the towns, right? Like you see this whenever a third world country or a country in the global south, underdeveloped country, quote unquote, is capitalized, whenever it becomes a capitalist country, the first thing that has to happen is that the peasantry have to be moved off the land, right? And, we see that with, communism in the 20th century too, right? Like, in Russia or whatever, any of these countries where they had peasant-based communism, is you got to move the peasants off the land and into the cities because they're mimicking the same kind of production process that capitalism does. And, that is why, like, we are alienated from the means of production as workers, including nature in general, right? Like we're literally spaced in our daily existence away from nature in such a way that we could actually just change our relationship to it.
The closest I get to nature most days is that from the back room of my apartment, I can look out onto a car park and there's an abandoned car there that is swarming with mold and fungus. And that's all the nature I can fucking see from the window.
Only in Scotland. Only in Scotland. But like, there's some like just I'm down in the country now. I'm in my parents' house, or whatever, and it's like just to the level of which this alienation gets to me. Like my neighbour, she's got Alzheimer's and she's in the home, so the house beside my neighbour's, beside our house, is kind of, it's empty. She gets a gardener in, right? She gets this gardener in to like tend to make sure the house doesn't fall into ruin and repair and the garden doesn't go crazy. And what he's doing is essentially where he doesn't want weeds to grow, he sprays Roundup. Okay, now so all the trees are slowly dying. Like there's all these kind of fine trees, and like sections of them are dead. Like entire like a third of lots of them. Just all sections, like a whole like large branch of a tree is like dead. Like, and there's like 10 or 20 of these, and it's like open bare soil, okay? And where he's spraying it with Roundup instead of like throwing even like just throw fucking grass seeds or wildflowers or something. It's like it's more efficient to spray Roundup. So basically, they're just like killing the soil. My mother, who's a big gardener, like, she's all, I'll attract the butterflies, I'll attract this. And what she does as well is she goes around with salt and washing powder and throws it to stop, like, weeds growing. So it's basically like poisoning your soil. And then over here being organic, it's just like people have this very messed up idea about bare soil, grass. It's just, even people who are into nature, it's so deeply embedded.
Yeah, well, and this is Marx's point, right? That it's not like if you live in the country, you aren't alienated. Because if you live in the country in a capitalist system, you are still dependent on capitalist production, right? And there is an element of the social productive process living in the country that you are not a part of because you don't live in the town, right? Like when Marx and Engels talk about the division between town and country, they want that to be transcended. They don't want everyone to go to the country and live a country life. They don't want everyone to be a sack of potatoes, as Marx said about the French peasantry, right? Like, when what is it? Engels talks about the idiocy of rural life. He's not saying, oh yeah, you go live in the countryside and then you got it made. It's all over. Like, I've seen this, I've lived in the country and there's definitely an alienated nature to that as well. Like, that's why you get the rural politics of alienation and resentment. Is because the social being is divided and alienated from itself.
Yeah, you're still going to be disciplined by that, regardless of kind of where you end up. Or even if you go way out into the sticks, it's going to catch up to you, as Burkett does describe, right? The kind of like consolidation and spreading dynamic of capitalism, where it like roots into the ground in one place and hyper urbanizes and then spreads elsewhere and repeats the process over and over. That machine will catch up with you, regardless.
That was really good. Do you want to just explain, Shane, why it does that? Do you remember like how he explains it?
So it kind of it's kind of this process of urbanization, right? Like, it's kind of drawing people together into one place by ejecting them from the land, drawing them together to concentrate them in one place with all the fixed capital, the plant and stuff, it kind of goes nuts and like destroys the environment around it. Putting everyone in that place causes them to unionize and stuff, so it gets too troublesome for capital, and then it goes somewhere else that's not yet urbanized and plonks itself down and does that again, which you see a lot, especially in the United States, right? Like in its history of like the East Coast gets militantly unionized, and the sweep of capital just proceeds west into places with less workers' militancy.
Yeah,
and
southwest. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's the like consolidate, like intensify and then spread, intensify, spread dynamic.
And he quotes, I think it's either Marx or Engels, describing how this actually was happening in England at the village level before it happened at like the US level, you know, like it was like you have one village that becomes a manufacturing town, and then the workers become too militant, so then the capitalists would go and turn another village into a manufacturing town and a city, and so on and so on.
Indeed. And he also kind of like zooms up to the kind of higher level of like the way that capital is sort of able to burn through particular ecosystems and destroy particular localities, and seemingly burst through these limits by just shifting its attention somewhere else and destroying that instead. But this will collide with a global limit eventually. But it's not a contradiction to say that like capitalism can continue to operate even when its slash and burn tactics destroy the locality. It's just it will eventually run out of localities to destroy. But for the moment, it is quite happy to do that.
Yeah, it has an unprecedented capacity in history to distribute itself geographically and thereby evade ecological crisis.
Burkett also calls out specifically like its development of communications and transport technologies that enable the distribution. But the distribution is not really ever decentralization. It's setting up more opportunities for centralized in-place intensification. It's not that like, oh, there's a moment of centralization and intensification, and then there's like a relaxing where things become more distributed and seem to go back to like go backwards. No, it's always going forwards. It's just doing this like sideways weaving scuttle to get there and like working its way through more and more resources, leaving more and more ash and rubble behind it.
And just to be perfectly clear about why capitalism is able to do this, it's because it operates through the abstraction of value, and it is able to, use market relations to operate in a general global sense, whereas previous modes of production were tied directly to the land in a very real and material way. And so if, your if your land got salted or your soil got exhausted, well, it's your land and everything's tied to that land, so you're basically screwed, right?
So I'm kind of aware that we've this is a lot of the stuff in chapter 7, which I think we've alluded to a lot of, but could we clarify exactly what this value nature divergence or value nature divergence is? Just kind of summary of what's going on there, because it's a kind of background radiation in a lot of these discussions.
Right. So Burkett does chapter 7. It's called Capitalism and Nature, a Value Form Approach. Capitalism's social separation of workers vis-a-vis necessary conditions of production allows for a competitive, profit-driven development of the combined productive powers of labor and nature. This separation and combined development, with its increasingly complex and technologically advanced social division of labor, loosens the constraints placed on production by particular natural conditions. It does so, however, only by broadening and deepening human appropriation from and material impacts on nature, in line with the imperatives of competitive profit-making. Capitalism thus overcomes particular natural limits only by placing increasing pressure on the global biosphere as a whole. The social roots of capitalism's environmental crisis tendencies are only fully revealed, however, when one considers the tensions with nature built into the value form of commodities, money, and capital. So he basically goes back to Capital Volume 1, Chapter 1, and the description of the value form there, right? So he starts by saying the commodity, like all use values, is a product of both labor and nature. Value, the substance of wealth in its specifically capitalist form, is, however, simply the abstract social labor time objectified in commodities. So, again, for the listener, to clarify, use value is not a type of value. Use value and value are distinct and antithetical things. It's very confusing, but that's the terminology that Marx is using.
Right. So the use value is the utility, like the sensuous, real kind of usefulness of a thing.
The use value is actually the material of the thing.
It is the material, but it's also all the sensuous qualities of the thing. It's essentially like whenever a human being moves into nature, moves through nature, and picks out a object as an object that is in their possession, everything about that object, like, you know, how it makes you feel, its exploitable natural qualities, its mass, its substance, all of its chemical composition, all that stuff is the use value of the thing.
Absolutely. And so, like, the value of the thing is the average amount of socially necessary labor time to make that thing. So you can have two identical objects. One stereo system made this year with 10 hours of labor, and an identical object from last year that took 20 hours of labor. Both of them are identical at an atomic level. Both have the same use value, okay? But they have a different value, okay? And you can also have two different objects that have different use values, like an apple and an orange, and they've got exactly the same amount of socially necessary labor time in them. So they have different use values with the same value. You can have the same use value and different values. And then we're not even talking about exchange value, which is essentially, in modern terms, we can just think of it as the price. Yeah. So, and the price won't necessarily be it will have a correlation to the amount of labor in it, probably, but there are so many rents and patents and copyrights, all manner of stuff going on in the real world that pull the price of a thing away from its true amount of socially necessary labor time value. So we've got these three bad boys, okay? And most errors in most, stuff we read about, like Marx, interpretations of Marx and stuff like that, come from just rudimentary, mixing up of those three simple. Look, fundamentally, to me, I think that's Marx's most fundamental insight in economic theory is the value form. Because practically everything flows from it, except from, like, exploitation, but all the other stuff flows from this. You do not need really exploitation so much to get a falling rate of profit, but you need the value form to get that stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. And this contradiction is also, like, very core to what Burkett is doing in this book, right? That, like, as living beings, we are concerned most with the, like, use value, the utility of objects and the way they can help us live. But capitalism and markets as this like capitalist system is concerned with the value, the like social necessary labor time. And this is this is the half-blind accounting, where the only thing that's accounted for is this metric of human labor time expended on things, but not the actual usefulness or the like anti-usefulness of things, like where toxic waste is anti-useful. It's like an anti-particle of utility, but it's still produced because it's profitable to do so. And this fundamental divergence is the divergence of capitalism from its natural basis. It's not the divergence of humanity from nature. It's that capital orchestrates a divergence between the social system that humans are organized under versus the like material natural substrate on which it's based. So it's not really humans that are in the driving seat here for this thing. It's the like that thing that Moore was going on about with the like Anthropocene sort of stuff. It's like, well, it's not Anthropos that's doing this. It's Capitalos is the thing that's doing this.
You can look at a graph they have historical graphs of economic growth, and you can look at it and, it's literally going at between 0 and 1% growth until about 1650, and then it just goes. So there was humans before then, right? And we didn't have that growth dynamic. So that, you know, like, it is in the social organization that has caused that, and it's not an intrinsic, it's not a thing of humans to be like that outside of their material and social relations. I think that's the way to put it. Yeah. One thing before we go, there's one thing, like, there's a place where he described like value, and I think he described it as a in a good way, is that it is a social measure of wealth. Is a good way to put it. Yeah, but it's not a very good one. That's the point. Yeah, and like the whole thing as well is like the social relation and the value form and how it operates. It means that not only is everything like, you know, we only value commodities essentially, but the social relations actually determine what the commodities are. I think like that he touches on this a bit, but I think it's very important. Like, you know, I can't, I'm living in the say countryside here now with parents. I can't like go cycling around some of the busy roads here. Like, capitalism doesn't give me that. There's loads of things I would like to be able to buy. I'd love to be able to buy clean air or like fucking, you know, there's loads of stuff that capital cannot give you. It literally, the social relations will prevent from being a thing. Like, more free time is what we all want more. Who the fuck wants to be working more? Capitalism can't offer us that on a systemic level. So, like, it's a goddamn shitty measure of wealth. You know, it's a shit measure of wealth.
Yeah, well, and that is because in capitalism, ultimately all production is production for sale. So everything has to be mediated through capitalist valuation. Like, you can make stuff, you know, as a hobby or whatever, but that can't be, like, at a certain point, if you're going to do your hobby that you love doing and you make these things you love, at a certain point, you are going to have to enter into market relations with your hobby. It'll become your work. You'll be selling the stuff. And then the quality of the thing that you are selling will also change because it has become a commodity. It's just the way it is because, you know, we are social beings. We reproduce ourselves socially. So you cannot live in a capitalist society and not live off of things you buy on the market. That's just a basic fact, and that means you're always compelled to produce for the market.
Yeah, and it's also it's the same for the production side as well. Like, you can, like, I mean, there's this niche sort of artisan whatever stuff, but it's always going to be this niche kind of elite consumption stuff because you can make your hand woven baskets or whatever, but you're up against fucking everyone else that's making commodity baskets, and it's a losing game every time unless you have some bizarre pitch that's like, oh, these are like, this is why so much of that like artisanal crap is like, they put so much into the marketing of it because that's the only thing that can really sell, because ultimately it's the same basket as everything else is, and trying to make a living off of doing that isn't going to work out in the long run, really.
Right. Like, the arts and crafts movement is essentially trying to ignore these basic social facts that we are laying out here and just pretending they're not there, and through like force of will saying, oh no, but we're going to make use values for use values' sake.
They only exist on the surplus of the bourgeois.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so I just want to, you know, skim through the basic points that Burkett is bringing up in this chapter. Sorry, apologies to both Moore and Burkett for that, because I know they don't get along. So, all right. So quantitatively, capitalism only ascribes value to nature insofar as its appropriation requires commodity-producing labor, even though nature's contribution to production and to human life more generally is not materially reducible to this labor of appropriation. So, Tom, you already brought this point up. In short, the value form qualitatively and quantitatively abstracts from nature's useful and life-giving characteristics, even though value is a particular social form of wealth, a particular social objectification of both nature and labor. This contradiction helps explain capitalism's tendency to despoil its natural environment, which is the main argument of this chapter. A second corollary argument is that the common complaint that Marx's value theory inadequately recognizes the productive role of limited natural conditions should be redirected towards capitalism itself. So those are the things we kind of brought up. And, I think we've hit most of the points that Burkett brings up in this chapter.
Maybe there's a tiny minor point that he also emphasizes the simplification and homogenization of nature, the variety reduction, that value is treated as being it's quantitative but homogeneous, whereas nature is qualitative and heterogeneous. But the value form tramples all over this and smashes it into a grid of coordination of things.
It tries to homogenize nature wherever possible in order to increase the regularity of turnover and the predictability of production.
Just the cheapness as well, just the actual labour efficiency.
The cheapness, yeah.
There's an excerpt here, David Harvey, who I give out by a lot because he's hardly even a value theorist. Can I read this quote of Harvey here? Because on this point here, I think it's good.
Yeah, sure.
Money prices attached to particular things. Sorry, I'm just going to drink water. Actually, Kyle, will you read it? It's on page 86. Fuck it.
All right, so Harvey says, money prices attached to particular things and presuppose exchangeable entities with respect to which private property rights can be established or inferred. This means that we conceive of entities as if they can be taken out of any ecosystem of which they are a part. We presume to value the fish, for example, independently of the water in which they swim. The money value of a whole ecosystem can be arrived at, according to this logic, only by adding up the sum of its parts, which are constructed in an atomistic relation to the whole. Indeed, pursuit of monetary valuations commits us to a thoroughly Cartesian, Newtonian, Lockean, and in some respects anti-ecological ontology of how the natural world is constituted. So you run into this problem with, for example, the attempts to marketize natural goods, right? We're gonna take this ecosystem we want to protect, we're gonna put a price on it, and then we're going to marketize it so that people will say, oh yeah, I value, this national park this much, and therefore it can have a market price and people will pay for it because they value it subjectively, right? The problem with that is you end up in this summing up all the individual components approach, which is absolutely nonsense. I know personally people who have worked in environmental ministries and had consultants come in and try to do this approach, and they're just sitting there being like, this is absurd. This is completely absurd. They get a directive from the minister to, implement this market-based ecological protection scheme, and they're looking at how do you value a frog? That people don't consume as a commodity. It's not like they eat the frogs. It's just, how do you value the presence and existence of a frog independent of the holistic ecological system in which it exists?
The winning move is to not play in this game, I think. It's the reductivism, the modern Cartesianism that Pickering was railing against in Cybernetic Brain, right? So that these are complex systems that are living and composed of more than the sum of their parts because they're relational. But this is a social system of derangement, right? It is gone off in its own bizarre loop that is completely diverged from the reality of the world. But it insists on reimposing its crazed view of how things work back onto the world and destroying it in the process.
And there are these market-based carbon credit schemes and this kind of thing, and they become the subject of capitalist speculation, and, the criminal underworld uses them to launder money and all this kind of stuff. But for me personally, when it really hit home how absurd these carbon credit schemes are, was when I was in New Zealand the other year. We were traveling through the mountains and we saw these large swaths of forest that had been planted in with pine, because pine is a very fast-growing tree, and therefore it's very good at capturing carbon, right? Like your carbon capture per annum is very good with a pine tree, right? And these little patches of pine forest are surrounded with the native trees of New Zealand. And they're just radically different species, you know? And I heard that there were fires in this part of New Zealand, you know, before I went there, like in the previous year. And they were saying, like, this is the first time they've had a major forest fire like this in the history, recorded history here, because that's just not what the climate and the ecology does. And the trees there, the natural trees, the indigenous trees, are not suited to burns because they just don't happen. And then it's like you realize the reason the burns were happening, the forest fires were happening, is because they came into this ecosystem, cleared out a bunch of land, and planted a bunch of pine. So their carbon capture scheme was actually causing forest fires that were putting more carbon into the atmosphere. You know?
Like, you just got to go around Ireland. Shane, you know this. Ireland, in 1900, Ireland had 1% forest cover. I think it was the most deforested country, and maybe in the world at one stage. Now it's back up to 10. But what did they plant it with? They planted it with spruce.
Yeah.
And why did they plant it with it? Because it grows 3 times faster in Irish soil than it does in Norway, right? But the problem is that when you've got these pine forests, they drop pines which are acidic, and so the floor of the forest is covered in acidic pines. It's dead. No birds hardly live in it. There's no ecosystem going on. There's hardly a mushroom in a pine forest. So you get these large swathes of pine. It's just like killing things. And I'm sure that's why they went on fire, because it's like, there's basically tinder on the ground, the dry tinder that would have been like in a wet environment. You know, you can't, it's just impossible to understand how badly these things are even run on their own logic. In the European Union, they had to set the price of the carbon. And so they had to set up all the infrastructure, and then they had to make the political decision, what price are we going to set it at? And the ecologists or whatever were saying, like, well, it needs to be set at like 50 euros a carbon ton or something. And the politicians went, oh, that would affect production too much. So they said, oh, we'll set it at like 10. So it ended up having no effect. So it becomes a scheme for like literally financial trading and weird, just speculative.
It's just speculative. And when they were setting up these schemes, you had experts saying, like, you know, experts who are used to like financial regulation and this kind of stuff, market regulation, they're saying, well, you're setting this thing up and it's just going to become a nightmare of speculation and money laundering. And they're saying, no, like, this is for good. We're doing this for like pro-social reasons. We're setting up these carbon credits. People are going to do it because of their conscience. No, of course not. The value form is determinative in the final instance here.
Yeah, like, and the other thing about, like, I've seen some stuff of, you know, what you're talking about there. You know, they had some people, like, in the rainforest in Brazil or something up, like, with measuring the amount of CO2 that's going in and how much oxygen is coming out, and they're going, oh, yeah, like, now we can put a strict measure and we can make a value price on this stuff. But the problem with all that rubbish is, right, what happens if it's more profitable to cut down the forest and fucking grow cattle? Should you do it? It gets, like, you're giving into the logic straight away, because, like, it must be happening for some reason that these forests are getting, you can plunder the virgin forest, you can sell that oak, or not oak, but like teak and like these expensive hardwoods, you know, and then you can put cattle on it, ranch it, and make money every single year while the earth burns.
Yeah, and the problem is that these schemes come from the perspective of neoclassical economics, where the engagement of the individual with the market is about a subjective ranking of values, right? So the idea is, if I, as an ethical human being, decide that I value ecological continuity and health above short-term profit, I will invest in carbon credits because I care personally as a subjective individual about that issue, and then you just educate enough investors and consumers in the value of this, and subjectively as individuals, they will vote with their dollars to protect this. But when you look at it from like a Marxist value perspective, it's a complete absurdity because you understand the social holism of this problem and the ecological holism of this problem, not what a subjective ranking of values at the individual level would achieve.
Indeed. And I mean, it can even backfire with like, you make it a sort of personal virtue thing and a kind of like preference thing. And then you're going to get people, deliberately rolling coal, as they say, like making it a fuck you to the libs to like deliberately.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Like trigger the libs by buying coal. Right.
Yeah. Or people who like work in oil and gas stuff and they know which side their bread is buttered on. And they're like, well, fuck these libs. We're going to have to go with the oil and gas stuff.
Yeah. I mean, you still see people in Calgary here walking around with t-shirts that say I heart, and then it has a little picture of Alberta and it has a drop of oil,
know. Oh my god.
This was a propaganda campaign that was rolled out by the oil and gas industry here, and it really took at the popular level. And people they have it on their bumper stickers, they have it on their t-shirts, their hats. And yeah, it's like I'm triggering the libs by wearing this shirt,
Yeah, Christ.
I must say, I do like the concept of triggering the libs, though. I think it's, I do admire them for it. No matter how skullduggery it is, triggering the libs, I stand by it.
The thing is, when you're doing it in a way that is like obviously astroturfed by some PR firm.
That's nearly better.
Like it's foolishness. It's just pure foolishness.
No, you gotta love the trolls.
Yeah.
You gotta love the trolls. So there's a couple of things. There's one bit in here where he getting on from what Kyle was talking about, neoclassical economics. They have a quote here from Solow, Robert Solow. He's like, arch god. I think he's MIT professor, neoclassical maths genius guy. And, he talks about how supply and demand will work to solve all our problems. He goes, as the Earth's supply of particular natural resources near exhaustion, and as natural resources become more and more valuable, the motive to economise those natural resources should become as strong as the motive to economise labour. The productivity of natural resources should rise faster than now. It's hard to imagine otherwise. And he goes blah 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 blah. But you mind goes through and breaks down most of these arguments. It's like, what happens when say for example, let's take white rhinos or something, right? They were hunted for their horn. And it was probably reasonably hard to get the horn, to hunt them, and then you would get some good money, right? But as they became rarer, the value of selling that rhino horn was worth a lot of money. So now people would have to harder until you fucking wipe them out. That's the logic. From a lot of, the logic is actually not you get to a place where they're more expensive, is that they get more expensive and then you go all out, you destroy the thing and you get it all. That's the actual logic. Till you get to a point of where there's 20 left, and then if they're the wrong species, if they don't have the the reproductive rate for you to come back from the brink, then they're done. There's the logic of whale oil and all that kind of stuff. The logic is hunt to practical extinction. That is the logic. I think the logic for capital when it comes in a system-wide it'll be kind of similar, although I don't think you can get all the way to extinction, but it'll get close enough.
I think it'll continue to ruin shit pretty badly, and I could certainly imagine this ever decrease, because I think that the author here puts a lot of emphasis on the progressive degradation of living conditions. I could certainly imagine capital continuing to operate in its psychotic way as things just continue to get worse and worse. And you end up with what remains of humanity living in fucking underground bunkers, and they're like, well, hey, at least we're not dead or whatever. And it keeps getting worse and worse and worse, while whatever's left of the stock market just keeps happening, and keeps going nuts.
But Shane, that's where the dialectic kicks in. That's the dialectic. You know, like that's the systemic logic. I do think that's the dialectic kicks in before we get there. That's my own personal. There's one other bit here, but there's one bit here, I think he does talk excellently about the value of form and all that, but when he tries to touch on like thermodynamics slightly and brings it into a Marxist point of view, to me this is like actually he gets stuff wrong here. There's a bit on page 103, okay, where he quotes Elmer Altvater. He says, in the creation of value, it is in fact only labour that is able to create value and surplus value. From the standpoint of the energy cycle, labour, i.e. the worker, is brought to put more energy, brains, muscle, heart and hand, into the process than he in the end gets out of it in the form of energy and matter. The surplus goes to the capitalist in the form of surplus value. But that's just wrong. Right? So think about this, right? Like, say I'm employed to teach some kids, okay? And I'm employed for one day, I teach, and I get paid what are the teachers, right? They're probably getting €200 a day to teach, okay? Right? I put a certain amount of energy. Well, how much food, for example, do I need to teach that day? X grams of pasta or whatever. But with that €200, I could buy probably 100 kilos of goddamn pasta. Like that, you could put in less energy and get more energy out monetarily. So that way of trying to put thermodynamics into value theory, that is a total error. That does not make any sense. From a value point of view, there's a surplus, but from an energy point of view, there may be a deficit. So even though there's a surplus, a value surplus, there will be a deficit. So I think even Burkett falls prey to trying to misapply value theory.
Yeah, definitely, right. Yeah, that one's pretty weird, right? Like, I guess we'll probably have to read the fuck is that Beale book, The Entropy of Capitalism. I think there's maybe a better thermodynamics thing in there. But yeah, this thing of like, you can certainly think of like at the very highest level of like the kind of thermodynamics of the Earth system itself, right? That like everything is ultimately energy received from the sun, and it's an open system that receives new energy every day. And any given organism is also an open system. But so there's I don't know. A lot of people misunderstand the thermodynamic stuff as being about closed systems. Like that quote about closed systems kind of coming to equilibrium, but there's no reason for an open system to do that. It could be surplus deficits all over the fucking place. There's no reason for that to balance out that way.
Do you get more energy out of podcasting?
Definitely.
Than you put in? No, I don't think so.
No. It's a tiring exercise. I'm usually kind of wiped out the day after a medium session. Do you want to give us like a kind of quick rundown of like the whistle stop tour of concepts in part 3, and then I guess we can just kind of crawl through the final chapter.
So in part 3, we're mainly concerned with communism, but the first chapter, 11, is the nature and historical progressivity of capitalism. So this chapter is describing why Marx thought capitalism was progressive and how he thought it was progressive, right? Because, there's this claim, Burkett lays it out here. He says, perhaps the most common ecological criticism of Marx is that in applauding capitalism's development of the productive forces as a precondition of communism, he succumbs to a Promethean or productivist conception of history. Prometheanism, firmly rooted in the Enlightenment tradition, says that human progress hinges on the subjugation of nature to human purposes. Human development thus involves a struggle between people and nature in which people come out on top. The critics labeling Marx a Promethean typically suggest that he foresees a continuation and even an intensification of human domination over nature under communism, conceived as a society of ever-expanding per capita levels of material production and consumption, with reduced work time as enabled by further development of the mechanized technologies bequeathed by capitalism. So like the fully automated luxury communism idea, basically. So he is going to go through and basically provide textual evidence to say that, one, the reason why Marx and Engels saw capitalism as progressive was because it removed the necessary relationship, the determinate relationship between an exploiting coordinator class and an exploited producing class because of the level of material abundance it could create. So in historical materialism, there is a recognition that prior to capitalism, you essentially had two options. You could have an egalitarian hunter-gatherer society, or you could have a class-based exploitative society that was based on agriculture, more or less. And, you know, they essentially followed, like, prior to capitalism, they essentially follow Aristotle in saying that every society must have slaves. Like, it could be a peasant, it could be a slave, it could be an indentured servant, it could be a serf, it could be any number of different kinds of exploited worker. But there must be exploited workers because otherwise society is not going to have enough food and goods to reproduce itself. Under capitalism, that necessity is removed even as the relationship of domination continues. It opens the door to the possibility of a higher level of communism where we are not engaging in exploitative relations with each other, but we still all have enough to live and can have a varied and sophisticated social life.
And like two of the prongs of this are the socialization of production by stitching together previously isolated units of life production into like globe spanning totalities of interconnectedness. And also that the development of productive forces, both mechanical and human, kind of remove the scarcity justification for class exploitation, that like it was necessary to subjugate yourself to the king because of like scarce conditions and so on, is the only person capable of coordinating society in those conditions. The hyperabundance can remove any of those justifications, and it removes the justification for capitalism itself, really.
Right.
Ultimately. So the capitalism is supposed to melt down that way.
It opens the way to the complete abolition of class society.
And crucially, there's no way to get there without going through this horrific nexus of acceleration. That like it contrary to the reactionary ideal where there's like, oh, the way to paradise is to go backwards. There's nothing for us backwards. It's just more fucking tyranny, more degenerate forms of tyranny. Like the way he's quoting Marx here is that like it's not that the future communist society will be an orgy of consumption. It'll be a less restricted relation between humans and nature. Yes. Not in the sense of less restricted as you will be free to trample all over it like crazy. It's that it'll be more like, say, the culture or whatever, where it's this like hyper developed, rational and like loving relationship with nature, right? That like we can now actually appreciate our materiality and the materiality of the world and relate to it properly as we should relate to it, without all these class distortions and these tyrannies. But you can't get there by turning back. You can't get there by staying in capitalism. It has to push through and actually liquefy those relations.
Right. That is the second reason they give for why Marx saw capitalism as progressive, which is that it allows for this freer relationship with nature that was previously restricted to closer to bare survival. I think that's an exaggeration because, you know, obviously there are many pre-capitalist cultures or pre-agricultural cultures that have quite a deep, varied culture. But nonetheless, you know, we can imagine that having an understanding of ecology, having an understanding of the world as a whole, as opposed to just the small part of it we live in, we could have a more varied relationship to nature than would have been possible in a hunter-gatherer society.
There's like bits here where he's quoting from Marx that like on the one hand comparing the kind of past as like mere nature idolarity versus the future in which we're capable of a freer recognition of nature as their real body.
Yeah.
That latter part sounds kind of bong rip and stuff, but that's really cool, right? Like that, like on the one hand you have this mere sort of like idolization of nature, and then you have this like futuristic like recognition of the nature is our body, right? Like that we are social material beings, and this is like it's a very like
it's post Cartesian understanding of nature.
Yeah.
Deeply dialectical. When you read these things, you go, how can you have these crude interpretations of what he says? I know maybe you haven't read everything, but it's like,
If you want to.
yeah. One of the big things as well, there's a tendency, he talks about getting away from this kind of Prometheanism. Marx talks about the tendency of like increasing in free time, and the tendency of free time to be less intensive for material stuff than productive work. So if you're working 40 hours a week now, if you're only working 10 hours a week, you know, the 10 hours you're working versus the 30 you would be working, now your 30 are probably much more contemplative or...
And I mean, let's be realistic for, you know, your average worker. We're talking closer to
60.
like 60 or 70 hours a week.
Mm-hmm. Especially podcasters, you know, it's a tough grind.
If you get it down to 10, yeah, I mean, like you spend the rest of your time hanging around, get a hammock out the back, go fishing, all that kind of shit, yeah.
Well, it's weird, like, I know, like, we're commies, but, you know, like, when I look back at when was I happiest in my life, you know, I would say, when I was in college, you know, and I was broke, right? And you had, like, people you were hanging around with, you were broke all the time, but, like, the stimulation that you had, or just the general camaraderie and the communal living that you have when you're in college, either in a dormitory or with a house with your friends or someone who you choose, like this idea that consumption, that when we would have a communist society, people would be going like an orgy of consumption, it seems counterintuitive to me. I don't think that's the case. I think actually, after a while, I think people would settle down to really quite parsimonious lives, really. Like, if we think about the lockdown, what's happened to people in the lockdown, I've heard loads of people saying, well, God, I don't spend half of the money, I don't miss it. You know, I miss the people, but I don't miss the rubbish. You know what I mean? And I think there's we're not trying to sell a kind of a primitive anarcho, but I think there's definitely an element to like that in what I would expect to happen in a communist society.
We could certainly chill it out, certainly. And that's why I kind of hate that fucking Aaron Bastani, Novara Media, like, oh, you know, where they have the picture of the fucking infinity pools and like, this is what communism is. No, it's fucking not. Like, come on, like, get out of there with that shit. I can definitely understand like how, like, if you're in this kind of abjected, alienated state and you would really like to sit in an infinity pool, that's a sort of appealing vision of communism, of like, this kind of like abject luxury, like taken to its extreme, because it could be like, oh, because if you're starving, you want a shit ton of food, right? That's how that works. But that's definitely not what Marx is going on about. It's not like a feasible or like sensible relation to nature in the slightest. We should be thinking more in terms of like cooling our shit down, in terms of consumption as communism, rather than like ramping it up so that, oh, everyone's going to have an infinity pool. Imagine just like a completely flat fucking desert of concrete, you know, with
suburbia but with infinity pools.
Yeah. But also suburbia is everything. Like everything is fucking paved flat to make suburbias, and that's nature is obliterated completely. That seems to be where that stuff's going, and it's fucking horrible, you know.
It's petty bourgeois communism. Communism for people who like changing the furniture every 3 years.
They like all the tacky shit that the fucking bougies do, yeah. Well, that's it for this episode. Join us again next time for part 3 of our discussion of Marx and nature. In the meantime, you can find us on Twitter at GIUnitPod. We're on Facebook, we're on all the podcast apps, so like, rate, and subscribe. If you go to patreon.com/generalintellectunit and throw us a couple of bucks a month, you can get access to our community Discord, where we hang around with the community and talk about cybernetic communism. This show is part of the Emancipation Network, a Marxist podcast network and research collective. Go to emancipation.network and check out our sister shows, such as From Alpha to Omega, Swampside Chats, Jumpsuit Utopia, and Mortal Science. They're wonderful shows and wonderful folks. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again next time.